Let's welcome AJ.
Well, first I have to say thank you so much for the invitation to come back. I cannot tell you how excited I was when I came off of John Nolan last night, and there's the Capitol and all its light, and I was like, Madison, welcome me back. So I'm very, very excited to be here. So in my academic career, as Julie alluded to, I wear two hats. One is in autism and early autism development, and the other is in sleep. And you would think that these are two very different areas, but they do actually overlap quite a bit. We just finished a 4-year study looking at the role of sleep in early autism development, but as you can imagine, 4 years, it takes a long time to really process and get this data ready. So this is a project that we actually snuck in the middle. I typically do longitudinal studies following infants for 1 year to 4 years. This was my first segue into having social media kind of help you collect data, and I have to tell you, I think I'm hooked. Going from samples of 100 to maybe 300 to, as you'll see in a little bit, over 500 in 2 weeks is mind-boggling. So let's first talk about the fact that this is not solely my work, right? This was a team project that I'm doing with Dr. Sarah Honecker at IU, Dr. Tamara Krebs at the University of Utah, and Dr. Jody Mindell. And thanks to a number of very supportive parents, a Facebook group that was designed to support parents who are going through the sleep training process. Now, I look out at this audience and I say, many of you are young, so I'm going to assume not all of you have infants. So let me just tell you a little bit about the sleep training process and what that means, right? Babies come into this world, they know how to sleep. We don't have to teach them how to do that. But sleep training is something that parents make a conscious decision to do with their infant to try to support and scaffold what's considered independent sleep. And let's talk a little bit about what sleep looks like, not only in the US, but in kind of the larger context of sleep. When we talk about sleep with infants, it often includes skin-to-skin contact. It can include a family bed. It often includes nursing, particularly in young infants. And if we look at the prevalence of co-sleeping and how often parents sleep with their infants, you'll find that it's very common in China and India, and less common in the United States, Canada, and regions of Europe. However, there's been a shift in this. And if we actually look at it at a population-based level, there are more families that co-sleep with their infants than families that don't. Now, I tell you this because you can't see it very well here, but some of you may remember there was a campaign. This was actually the City of Milwaukee's health department. And it was literally an anti-co-sleeping campaign. They were saying that sleeping with your baby is the equivalent of them sleeping with a sharpened machete. It wasn't a very popular campaign. It was very controversial. But ultimately, what I think it emulates is the very, very strong feelings that people have about how and when and where babies should sleep, and what is safe and what is not safe. Now, this campaign developed out of a number of recommendations that have come out by the American Academy of Pediatrics, by the Sleep Research Society, that it is not that they just came out of nowhere, but I think it's important for you to have an understanding of this culture and of what it is that the parents are being told, right? This, oh, you can't read the best line. So this is the work of Dr. James McKenna, and the title line is Why Babies Should Never Sleep Alone. And there are kind of two camps in the field of infant sleep research. The one camp is that we need to follow medical guidelines, like part of our role here is try to reduce SIDS, which is the sudden infant death syndrome. This is when an infant under 12 months of age who's healthy for all intensive purposes dies unexpectedly, often in their sleep. So there's that camp. And then there's this camp that talks about that having time with your infant, being there when they are asleep, when they need proximity, when it's dark, when typically and historically in our cultures, it was not a safe time for an infant to be alone. So we have these two really different perspectives. And parents get all of this information. Well, you need to sleep with your baby close, or you could ruin your attachment with your baby. You have to put your baby to sleep on their back or they could die, right? That they get really, really strong messages in a number of different directions. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the recommendations for the American Academy of Pediatrics, because this is a consistent message that all parents get from their pediatricians, right? Pediatricians are given this information. They say babies go to sleep on their back. Whether they're napping or whether they're sleeping through the night, put them to sleep on their back. Don't put them to sleep in some place that's soft, like your bed. Don't put them to sleep someplace that has pillows or even bumpers on the side or a cushy blanket. Breastfeeding is associated with better sleep outcomes or lower rates of SIDS. Give your child a pacifier, okay? Don't smoke or use alcohol. Don't overheat them or put things over their head. And get your baby vaccinated. Now, clearly some of these don't have a causal effect to SIDS, but they are correlated. For example, this vaccination piece. Epidemiological studies have found that infants who are delayed in their vaccine schedules are at elevated risk for SIDS versus those who are not. Not a causal relationship, but likely an association. But I want to point something out here. So you're a parent and you want to follow your doctor's recommendations, right? They're knowledgeable people. So I'm going to breastfeed my infant. I am dedicated to nursing my baby, but they can't sleep in my bed, right? Because then they could suffocate. So now I've got to get up and I've got to help my baby. Oh, but I want to make sure I give them a pacifier too, right? So then I nurse them, but then I have to put them up and then I have to give them a pacifier, but then they wake up in the middle of the night and they don't have their pacifier, so they crawl out and I've got to go give them their pacifier. I want to highlight that this is an effective campaign. This campaign was designed to reduce the incidence of SIDS, right? And it's been very successful. We have seen the rate of SIDS plummet over the last 20 years. It's been delightful. Babies are not dying from SIDS as often as they used to. But this is also a recipe for parents to lose a lot of sleep, right? So parents are trying to grapple between pediatrician recommendations and getting a good night's sleep themselves. Now, these don't quite come through. I'm going to go through these instructions very quickly because they're similar to the slides that we just had, but I want you to get a feel for the amount of information that parents are getting on this. They are inundated with messages about what are the right ways for you to sleep with your baby, right? That they have to sleep on their back, it's a firm surface. Room share. They should be in your room on their own firm mattress. Wait, what? This is a brand new recommendation that came out in 2017. Remember that work of James McKenna and that team where they were talking about proximity to your infant is crucial and important? The American Academy of Pediatrics has now picked up on this. And they say that infants should be in their own space, but in your room. And you should only bring your baby into your bed to feed and comfort them, but not to sleep. For those of you who have nursed an infant, you can recognize that can be a very challenging thing. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you nurse your baby. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you both fall asleep, right? Never place your baby on a couch, a sofa, or a bed. Bed sharing is not recommended for any babies. Very strong messages here. Keep soft objects, loose bedding, anything that could increase the risk of something going over your baby's head, but it is okay to swaddle your infant. Put them in something tight. It keeps going, folks. There's more, right? It keeps going and going. Try to give your child a pacifier at nap time. Don't smoke, don't use alcohol, and nurse your baby. Whew, that's a lot. Now, if that wasn't enough, that's only the message you get from your pediatrician or from your nurse practitioner. Then there is a huge onslaught of information in popular media. And there are a number of different books that are out there of telling you this is how you want your baby to sleep. So parents ultimately end up going and looking at all of these different behavioral sleep interventions, right? Like, I have to intervene in my child's sleep. I have to some way train them. And let's not forget Dr. Google, right? That all of these parents are immediately going to go to the webpage. This is the Pediatric Sleep Council webpage. If you are trying to send a parent to a place that has research-based information that is put in a digestible parent form, I do recommend this page. I have to say I'm on the council, so I have a vested interest in it. This is not without my own personal bias. But here's what we wanted to know in this project. Parents get all of these really strong messages, but in the end, what do they do? Okay, I've been talking to moms about their infant sleep for over 10 years, and almost without exception, this is how the conversation goes. I know I'm not supposed to, but this is what we do, right? That it is because there are messages that go in every direction, parents always feel like, well, you know, we found this, but we're not sure if it'll work. So what we wanted to know is, what are parents doing? Like in the real world with all of this information? And you'd be amazed. We know a lot about what pediatricians tell families. We know a lot about internationally kind of what the norms are, but what families are actually doing behind closed doors, we don't know a lot about. So this is where we approached a support group designed specifically for parents who were trying to train their infant, right? They had a goal that they wanted to sleep train their infant, and basically they wanted their child to fall asleep independently. Now, this talk is not about whether the Western ideal behind an infant sleeping alone in their own crib is right or wrong, or whether the co-sleeping models that are put forth in other countries are right or wrong. This is about when parents have the goal to sleep train their infant, when their goal is, I want my baby to sleep independently in a bed by themselves without me. What do? The group is designed to be a safe haven, right? It's a place where parents can go and not feel judged. I don't know if you guys noticed on the previous slide, it's 80,000 members. Now, not all of them are active, clearly at this point in time, but clearly this is an area where parents feel like they want support, they need support, right? So we got together with the admins of this particular Facebook page and we sent out a Qualtrics survey. We sent out a push on the webpage 3 times over 2 weeks. Very short period of time. We just wanted to get a slice in time of what families are doing. We provided no incentive whatsoever. We just said, your sleep training, we want to hear about it. We want to hear about your experience with sleep training your baby. And in that 2 weeks, we got 796 moms. I was like, I now understand why people use social media. So we got a ton of families. About 140 of them, 150 of them, just went in for about 5 questions and then said, this is not for me, and left. So we don't have their data. But our resulting sample was 652 moms, almost exclusively moms. And we asked them a lot of questions, right? We asked, what kind of behavioral sleep intervention did you do? Was it stressful? How long did your baby cry? Ultimately, how stressed were you? And within our sample, we had roughly equal numbers of boys and girls, right? We had infants that ranged from 1 month of age to 66 months of age. Now, keep in mind that parents could be reporting on a sleep training that they had done previously. So if their child was 66 months of age, maybe they're reporting on a sleep training that they did 2 years ago, or something along that lines. And our sample was more educated than the general population, right? That we had more individuals with master's and doctoral degrees than we would expect. And our sample was predominantly Caucasian and white, with the with the most common racial ethnic minority group being Asian, followed by Hispanic and Latino. So when we talk about generalizations for this, these 2 things are huge limiting factors. But these are the moms who are doing this intervention. So remember how I said parents could have done this sleep training a while ago? And we're asking them some detailed questions. How many minutes did your child cry? It's pretty detailed information to remember from a long time ago. So for any questions that included minutes or that included very specific information, we didn't include anybody who had done their sleep training more than a year ago. If we wanted to know, like, what type of intervention did you do? We figured they could accurately recall that. So we did use that for those particular pieces. So in the end, when we talk about the detailed data, we're talking about 516 families, okay? So what did moms do? So we gave them some categories, and we said there are hundreds of different sleep training approaches. But we asked them to think about these 4 types and which one most aligns with what you do. So first, let's talk about unmodified extinction. This is sometimes called the cry it out method. Let me paint you a picture of kind of what this looks like. So moms take their babies and they do 3 or 4 short non-arousing steps. This may include a diaper change, a bath, maybe a little lotion, a little cuddle time, right? This kind of consistent routine that they do. They're setting their child up for success. Then they put them in their bed, drowsy but awake, like they're calm, they're relaxed. They put them in their bed, and then they step away. The thing that makes this method called the cry it out method is that the child is then left to transition independently. And the child may cry out and may ask for the parent to come, but the parent doesn't respond and ultimately lets them cry. This, as you can imagine, is very, very hard for a lot of parents. We spend all of our waking hours during the day trying to get them not to cry, right? So there is a method called modified extinction. This is sometimes called the Ferber method. And this particular method starts out the same way, right? You have 2 or 3 calming steps. You get them ready for bed. They're drowsy. They're feeling good. They're comfortable. They're secure. You put them in their bed, say goodnight, and then you come back in intervals. Intervals that don't necessarily align with the child's crying or calling out. And so maybe you do 5-minute intervals, and every 5 minutes you come in and you're like, hey, honey, doing good? Okay. And then 5 minutes later, you ready for sleep? Okay. Maybe give them a little pat. And you do this again and again and again, and then they transition to sleep with the idea being that they never get upset, right? That you'll just be there, and this is the idea, right? Parents in the room are laughing. That then you can, and then over time you can spread out your checks, and it'll be like every 15 minutes, every 20, and then voila, they're sleeping through the night all by themselves. Then there are a set of approaches called the parent feeding approaches, because even those checks of checking in, if you can imagine, that doesn't always go the way you plan, right? You're checking in 5-minute intervals, and 3 minutes in she starts crying, and you're like, I'm gonna wait by 5 minutes. And then you go in and she's crying, and she's not gonna be happy with you just doing a 2-second pop in and then going back out. So parents have a hard time with this. So parental feeding supports, again, very similar. Set them up, nice calming routine, drowsy but awake. You're seeing a routine here, a pattern, right? Set them in their bed, but I'm not gonna leave. I want my child to know that I'm here for them. I'm going to stay in the room, but I'm not gonna provide direct support. I'm just gonna be here. It's like, good night, honey. And they just sit back and wait. These are those videos that you see on the internet where the moms are like on the floor, like trying to get out of the room ever so quietly, right? Because they're like, they've just been there and they're gonna transition out without providing that support. But this is atypical behavior of a parent to most infants, right? When your parent is in the room with you, they attend to you, right? And when they don't attend, it can be very upsetting. And then this is very upsetting because the parent is now sitting in the room with their baby crying, and they're like, good night, sweet dreams. But their baby is crying for up to 45 minutes, right? Then there's parental feeding with support. Same setup, same pieces, routine, drowsy but awake, but this time I'm gonna provide support until they transition to sleep. Maybe it's a back rub, and I just stand there and I rub their back until they transition to sleep. Maybe it's holding them in a rocking chair inside that room. This idea that I'm in the room and I'm actively helping them transition to sleep. The idea behind this being that I'm going to help them understand that this is the room, this is the space that we transition to sleep in, and then eventually I'll be able to transition myself out of that role, and they'll just know that this space is associated with transitioning to sleep. That it's not me, but it is this setup, this routine in this space that I've provided. So we asked parents, which one of these was most like the approach that you did? And we had most of our parents doing modified extinction. This is that one where you check in every 5 or 15 minutes, right? Hi, Mama's here, I'm good, good night. Right? And then the second most common was unmodified extinction. This is just put your baby in and let them cry. And then they will learn that when they go in at night and I turn off the light, that mom's not gonna respond. And that this is just a place where you transition on your own. And amazingly, parental feeding approaches were not common at all. We didn't have hardly any parents endorsing this. Now, this is likely selection bias, right? We went to a web page where parents are looking for support to go through sleep training. And these are the 2 most common sleep training approaches, right? Those extinction approaches. So part of this could just be who are the parents who are going to this website. Okay, so age at start. when parents start this, we were blown away. The average age that parents started was 5 months, with a mode being even lower. When pediatricians talk about sleep training with parents, when they talk about nighttime feeding with parents, it is normative for infants to awake multiple times a night at this age range. Like this is just a typical part of development. It is normative even up to 2 years of age for children to wake once a night. Right? This is not like my child has a problem, they're waking up in the night. This is development. This is what is typical for infants. So when we saw that across no matter which intervention or which behavioral sleep approach they used, that they were implementing it so early, that I think this nugget of information is one of the biggest things that's going to come out of this study. Not surprisingly, when parents decided to implement it, they did it both at bedtime and during awakenings. But for a substantial portion of families, they did it only at bedtime, with this idea that what I do at bedtime will naturally just carry over into the middle of the night. We're actually running a small intervention trial to ask just that question, that if you just do it at bedtime, does it naturally carry over? Because we don't actually know that. Okay, so this is the distribution of age of infants from 0 to 2 months all the way through 12 months and older. Didn't matter which intervention you did in general. I keep in mind that these ones have very small ends, so it looks a little bit different. But overall, the pattern is the same. I was really amazed to see how many 0 to 2 month olds were also like, it's time, baby. It's time that you learn that at night you're going to transition to sleep by yourself. Which, this is where I think we may need to adjust our recommendations to families. Like, families are getting a message that this is important, but it isn't developmentally appropriate to expect a 0 to 2 month old to be sleeping through the night without any care whatsoever. Okay, let's talk about if these worked. What happened? Right? Parents were like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose one of these approaches. And so we asked how intense their crying was. And indeed, all approaches, this was on a 0 to 5 point scale, parents were reporting it was extremely stressful, no matter which approach they used. When we talked about stress on the first night, you can't quite see this, but it's that same 5 point scale. Ultimately, parents were really stressed that first night, universally, no matter which behavioral intervention they did. But 1 week later, everyone reported significant drops in stress. Within the 7 days, they were, I wouldn't say they were enjoying it, but it wasn't nearly as stressful. How long did it take? This is what all parents want to know, right? How many days am I going to have to go through this, right? Let me look here. I think it's coming up here in a bit. We'll talk about this one in just a bit. But then the question is, how satisfied were parents with their behavioral sleep intervention? They decided to do this, and again, no matter which, whether they did unmodified extinction, modified, or parental fading, in general, this small group here had a little bit lower satisfaction, but 80 to 90% of families were satisfied, and they were happy with their behavioral sleep intervention. And were they successful on their first attempt? About 80% were successful the first time they did it. When we asked them about when their child cried the most, we expected, across the board, based on previous research, that it would be the first night. 90% of infants were going to do the majority of their crying. Previous research says that it will be about an hour, that first night your child will cry for about an hour. And we were really surprised to find that that was only true for about half of these babies. That really another quarter of them, it was that second, third, and fourth night. Now this is in direct contrast with what we tell parents, right? All of those behavioral sleep intervention books I showed you, we're talking about how you just make it through that first night. That first night is the toughest night. They're going to cry for a very long time, and then it will be okay. But for a good chunk of families, that's not the case. And I don't remember if I put this in here or not, but the average length of time that infants cried that first night was about 45 minutes. Okay, Let's talk a little bit about modified extinction in particular. It's the most common approach. It was the most common approach used in this particular study, and it has a lot of unique variables in and of itself. So we ask parents about their intervals, right? Like how short or how long were your intervals, right? The shortest being about 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes I'm checking in. The longest being about every 15 minutes. And parents are only in the room for about a minute. They just go in, check on their baby, and then pop back out. What are they doing when they're in the room? They may do comforting words or touch the child, right? They just go in. That's what's happening for a majority of them. But a good chunk also picked the child up, stayed with them till they stopped crying, or maybe gave them their pacifier back, right? We actually know very little about what it is that parents are actually doing on their checks. We know what we tell them to do, but what ultimately happens with infants and babies. This part's particularly interesting because a lot of the research says don't pick them up. But we have roughly a third, maybe a little less, that are actively picking them up and actively helping them to self-regulate. And this is very interesting. Were the checks helpful for your child? And everyone said, kind of. Were the checks helpful for you? That is where parents endorse them being helpful. So the checks in on the child were more helpful for parents than they actually were for the kids when their goal was for these children to be independent sleepers. So this is a question, right? Parents want to know what works best. Which one should I do, right? What's the right one to do for me? I'm going to break this down and talk about the two extinction approaches together because that's where a majority of our data is. And then we'll talk a little bit about the parent fading approaches. And we'll talk about a number of different variables, whether they had the same routine every night, whether the child slept in their own room, whether they slept in their own bed, how many minutes it took them to fall asleep. Ultimately, no matter what approach you used, we see that before the sleep intervention and after, there's a significant change. We go from a little over half sleeping or having the same routine to about 90% having the same routine. When they sleep in their own room, we had about half sleeping in their own room before the intervention and about 90% after the intervention. Did they sleep in their own crib? Again, about half. And then by the end of the intervention, we had about 90% of infants sleeping in their own crib and taking, instead of half an hour to fall asleep, taking less than 10 minutes to fall asleep. When we talked about difficulty falling asleep, we went from roughly a third of the sample having difficulty falling to sleep to being almost non-existent. That these parents were like, my baby no longer has difficulty falling asleep. For night awakenings, we had an average of about 4 night awakenings, which, given remember the age of these infants, between 4 and 6 months of age for a large chunk of them, that's appropriate. That's fully expected. And then we dropped down to roughly 1 per night. Now, are these infants actually waking less? No. What's happening is these infants are no longer crying out or bidding for their parents when they do wake. Right? So it's not that we're actually changing the amount of time that infants wake. What's changing is what it is that they do when they wake up. And then for nightly feedings, it went from 3 a night to roughly 1 a night. When we look at parental fading approaches, we see a very similar pattern, although it's not quite as robust. But I have to keep in mind that we had very small samples with these two particular groups. So some of these we didn't have the power to necessarily find it. But the overall pattern is the same, that we see increases in the consistency of their routine, the percentage that sleep in their room, that sleep in their bed, and the amount of time they take to fall asleep drops in all of the groups. And we saw the same patterns of lowered number of night wakings, lower number of nighttime feedings. So the answer is they all worked, right? Parents ultimately selected an approach that worked for them and their infant. And it didn't really matter which approach you chose to do, that we really saw that as a general rule, this is looking at whether the change that we saw from before and after was significantly different across the groups. And you can see in general, we don't see it. Every once in a while we see one pop up here, and it tends to be these parental fading approaches. But again, I don't put a lot of stock in that because we have such a small sample here. When we compare across the modified and unmodified, there's absolutely no difference. Okay, but which one was faster, right? This is what parents want to know. Like, I want this to be done. And the answer was it didn't matter, right? For about half of families, no matter which approach you used, it took about a week, right? For up to 80% of families, it took about 2 weeks, right? So by the time we hit 2 weeks, we've got roughly 80% of families who are, from the parent's perception, that their child was successfully sleep trained. Whew, and everybody was stressed about this, across the board. It didn't matter which intervention approach you used. Parents reported substantial stress that first night, but everyone also showed a substantial decrease in stress for across the first week. So when we talk about success, parents perceived success, the majority of parents across all 4 approaches perceived success. This one was slightly lower, but again, we have a very small sample on this particular one. We've got between 80 and 90% of parents saying that they were happy with how this intervention went. Now, keep in mind, we didn't go out selectively trying to find families who had successful experiences. We went out to just find families. And so we did find some, roughly 80, so that would have been a little less than 20% of our sample, who didn't feel like they were successful on their first try, right? And about half of those stopped in that first week. They just said it was not successful. I'm not willing to let my baby cry for this long, or to not go in and care for them the way that I care for them during the day. But then most of them went on to, well, I should say not most. Over half of them went on to do at least one more attempt. With families who did that second attempt, ultimately, 70% of them were ultimately successful. So in the end, if you take that 80% who were successful on their first try, and you add in those that did a second attempt, we have almost 90% who were successful. They perceived it as successful across those 2 interventions. Now, I want to reiterate, this information is not about whether or not you should sleep train your child, right? This information is about if you have made the decision to sleep train your child and you are trying to decide between these various approaches, this is what you can expect, right? Find the approach that is a good fit for your child, and within a week or 2, many families feel like it is successful. Okay. Families switched approaches, right? For those who ultimately didn't feel they were successful on their first one, they were like, okay, we need to try something different. And we were like, well, where did they go? Like, which way did they go? We were really surprised to see that they went from, most commonly, from modified extinction to unmodified extinction. So that habit of like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to check on my baby, they ultimately said, I can't do the checks, this isn't working, we're just going to do the cry it out method. So overall, parents felt like they were successful in the real world in implementing their behavioral sleep intervention, and that 90% reported this across 2 attempts, for a majority of them within 2 weeks. Okay. Parents perceived that these interventions made a significant difference in their child's sleep, right? That took them less time to fall asleep, they had less awakenings where they called for the parent, and that there were clinically significant reductions in night awakenings, or at least when the child calls out for night awakenings. So, not surprisingly, right, parents reported high levels of stress, but it did dissipate within that first week. And encouragingly, infant crying reduced substantially, right? We went from an average of 45 minutes down to less than 10 minutes within that first week. Now, I have a lot of parents come to me and they're like, that absolutely goes against like the core of my being, right? I practice attachment parenting. When my child calls out for me, I'm going to be there for them. And I'm going to be there for them whether it is during the day or during the night. And I think that these approaches are potentially going to contribute to on insecure attachment and that it's going to hurt my relationship with my child. I hear this all the time. And I tell parents that's fine. Like that, clearly that approach is what works for you. I want to make sure that you are not interpreting this data as in some way a knock or a diss or a disapproval of that given approach. That's not what this study is about, right? This study is about if you have made the decision that you want your child to be an independent sleeper in their own bed and you're trying to decide which approach to use and what works, then this information is good for you. And I also get the question a lot, like, well, doesn't it, like, this can't be good. You can't let your baby cry for an hour. The research does not demonstrate that having 2 weeks of a period of time where you are less responsive to your child, that has long-term ramifications for the attachment you have with your child. Ultimately, attachment is formed over long periods of time, over consistent responsiveness of behavior. If you are a contingent, responsive, positive parent throughout the day, and you have distinctly different behaviors at bedtime, the research doesn't demonstrate that it has those negative long-term effects, okay? I want to add one caveat to that. Emotional availability, or your ability to be able to read your child's cues of when it is that they really need you, is associated with maladaptive outcomes. So this is not to say that you should completely turn your parenting button off, right? This idea that you are emotionally there for your child, but just like you would teach your child you need to be quiet in a library, right? Or that there are different rules for different situations. Infants can learn in this situation that there are different rules for different situations, okay? Surprisingly, these infants are really young. So the message is getting out there to behaviorally sleep train your infant early, right? That's a message that's been reiterated for a very long time. I don't think the message was meant to send it this early. The message is generally before 12 months of age, right? And that you can start your routine, you can start that setup for success at around 4 months of age, right? At 4 months of age, you start doing those 3 to 4 calming routines at bedtime to kind of set them up for success. That is definitely consistent with the research and the message. But to do these cried out methods or these modified extinction methods, this is far earlier than a lot of the research suggests. And actually, when we look at the research and we say when modified or when these extinction approaches were used in infants under 6 months of age, the results are really mixed. That's why it was good we asked these questions, right? That we can find out what it is that parents are actually doing. And importantly, infants under 6 months of age still have short hunger satiety cycles. Like they still need to feed in the middle of the night, and that's a normative part of development. And it's okay to wake up in the middle of the night and go and nurse your baby. It should be expected. And let's bring this back to those American Academy of Pediatric recommendations, right? Breastfeed your baby for that first year, right? But don't put them in your bed, right? But give them a pacifier. And we're really setting parents up for these sleepless nights of back and forth and back and forth. So I think our recommendations to families still have a ways to go. I understand that the SIDS drive behind these recommendations. They were designed to help reduce the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome, and they've been successful at that. But they were not designed to give families a good night's sleep. And that's every family's ultimate goal, right? So this study had its strengths, right? It was a relatively large sample. We used gold standard questions and questionnaires, things that have been established in the sleep field, but it wasn't without its weaknesses as well, right? We have a huge selection bias in this sample. We sought it out, actually, right? We said, we want to know the parents who are doing these behavioral sleep interventions. And we may have had parents who had a vested interest in this being perceived in a positive way, right? And so they came into our questionnaire to present that. We have a starking lack of racial ethnic diversity. Like when we talk about who and where this is generalizable, and we really didn't consider it, and we functionally, by the virtue of this survey, really important other variables like infant temperament and other contextual variables going on. So take this information for what it's worth, but recognize, like with any study, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. Ultimately, this is the largest study of what parents actually actually do in their behavioral sleep intervention in the real world, right? We know what pediatricians tell them. We don't know what parents are actually doing. And this information can be really important to tell healthcare providers, right? This is what ultimately, all of that information you get them, this is what it translates into. That we've got parents potentially doing these interventions a little younger and earlier than anticipated, and this recognition of what is normative for infants. And it is normative at 6 months of age for infants to wake and to feed at night, okay? And I think it's also important to note that we didn't find significant differences in the different approaches, right? There's more than one right answer. That's good news for parents, right? They're always like, what is the right thing? What should I do? No, it's a completely unsatisfying answer, but it depends, and it's what works for your family, right? And that's what the research bores out. I would be a misgiving if I didn't acknowledge all of the families who took the time to fill this out and all of the admins on this Facebook page who were so open and let us come in and gather this information. And they let us gather it knowing full well that it could come out positive or negative with respect to the group. So we're really grateful in that respect. And I want to take just a minute here. So when I was a graduate student here, I had an opportunity similar to this to thank my mentor. And I didn't do it. And so I thought, I am not going to make the same mistake twice. I learned from my mistakes. So I want to just take this moment. I know many of you are graduate students in the room and undergrads, and so much of graduate school is about a goodness of fit between you and your mentor. And I have to say the fit between Julie and I was idyllic, right? I cannot thank Julie enough for her mentorship, for her guidance, for really the opportunities that she gave me to launch on this sleep path. So if you would indulge me for a moment, I just want to take a moment to give a round of applause to Julie and thank her.